Okay, we finally got it going. Hopefully we'll get rid of that. So we go back to 1949, and that is when Mao Zedong and the communist Chinese beat Chiang Kai-shek to take over the mainland. The Reds were a big problem in 1949. There's Mao Zedong, there's Joseph Stalin, and it is post-war, World War II, Cold War. United States against the Soviet Union, but China becomes a major problem. NATO starts in 1949, Harry Truman there. The end of the Berlin airlift in 1949. The Soviets, the Russians have the atomic bomb. Looking for communists everywhere in the United States, that's J. Edgar Hoover, Time magazine. This is prior to the McCarthy era, but already the House on Un-American Activities is going after people starting 1947. Ireland becomes an independent country. Jim Crow, the Groveland Four in Florida. Apartheid in South Africa. TV. How many of you remember your first TVs? What was your first TV?
I think it was a Zenith.
Zenith? What was your first TV? Do you remember?
Well, it was 1950. We had the first one on the block and didn't know you needed an antenna.
So it's all
It was
snow.
all fuzz.
All fun. Where'd you live?
Denver, Colorado.
Denver, Colorado. Yeah, they finally got TV out there. What was your first TV?
First TV was about in 1946, and it was so small that it had
It's
a
like
great big,
That?
it had a great big magnifying glass
Yeah.
mounted in front of it.
Well, anyway, for $279.50. Now, Magnavox big picture television, and you can even get a bigger model here, $349 for a Magnavox. That was a computer back in 1949. So you want to bring that into your room right now? That, the book 1984 came out in 1949. Joe Louis retires. Pro football merger between the All-American Football Conference and the National Football League, 1949. And there was also a basketball merger because the Basketball Association of America wanted this guy, George Mikan, in their league. That's my mother-in-law, 1949, American life. She has 2 kids by this point. Her husband had been killed in World War II on Christmas Eve, 1944. She remarries, and basically the GI Bill, she's going on with the rest of her life, as are many people in the United States. In the year 4 of post-World War II life, companies are able to supply cars, televisions, and other goods demanded in a consumer society. The cars got bigger. The TVs got bigger. 6.2 million new cars are sold in the United States, 10 million television sets in America, and that's pretty good considering that 1/4 of the television viewers were in New York, and many cities like San Francisco didn't even have a television station. But there was a recession that started in November 1948. Jim Crow was alive in the American South. Interracial marriage was banned in more than a dozen states in America. The recession would last until October 1949. Getting a job was more difficult. The unemployment rate, 5.7%. Reasons and causes? Well, the war in a way. Returning veterans re-entered the workforce in large numbers to compete with jobs, or for jobs, with existing civilian workers who had entered the workforce during the war, and unemployment began to rise. Women's work. What was a woman's work? Well, that's my mother-in-law again. She never went to college. She decided that why should she go to college? She didn't want to be a teacher. She wasn't going to become a doctor, but most women weren't. She wasn't going to become a lawyer. Most women weren't. She really didn't want to be a secretary. She could be a bookkeeper, so why go to college? Women back in those days, they could be librarians, be teachers, secretaries, bell telephone operators. there weren't that many options for women unless they had their own business.
Well, except you're not talking about the poor, lower-class women who were laundresses, who were
Laundresses,
maids,
yes,
who were
yes,
cleaners,
cleaners,
who
yep.
did all of that,
Yep.
and always worked and supported their families.
Yes, that is true. But I'm talking about for mainstream educated women. There weren't much choices. Women did women's work, teaching, clerical, nursing, domestic labor, which is what you were talking about, and being store clerks. Women face huge social problems to marry young, late teens, early 20s, and have a big family. The fair deal was something that Harry Truman proposed. He thought everybody in America should have a fair deal. January 5th, Harry Truman addresses Congress, State of the Union address. It says that every American has a right to expect our government, from our government, a fair deal. Truman, who was reelected in November 1948, announced his plan for domestic policy, including reforms, national health insurance, public housing, civil rights legislation, federal aid to education. He advocated for an increase in the minimum wage, federal assistance to farmers, and an extension of Social Security, as well as urging the immediate implementation of anti-discrimination policies in employment. But there were politicians who were totally against it. Conservatives, Southern Democrats in the Congress thought that the fair deal was socialism. One of the things in my business that really annoys me is that when people say, oh, it's socialism, there's never a follow-up question like, can you define socialism? They never do. They just let it hang. The Red Scare, the Red Menace, the most talked about drama of our time. Life was going to be good in America, for some, not for all. Remember, it's Jim Crow America. But there was fear. Communists lurking everywhere around the United States. Communism is spreading through the globe. The Berlin blockade, well, that's the Cold War, Soviets and the Americans. There was a lack of consensus with the Soviets on the future of Germany, led the United States, Great Britain, and France to support joining their respective occupation zones into a single independent state. In December 1946, they took steps to do so. But the Soviet Union wasn't too keen on England and France and the United States setting up shop in Germany. And they were afraid that there would be a pro-capitalist government set up in those zones. And they also feared that the possibility of a unified West Berlin located within the Soviet sector would be a major problem. 3 days after Western allies authorized the introduction of a new currency in West Germany, the Deutschmark, Stalin ordered all land and water routes to the western zones of the city of Berlin cut off June 48. Hoping to starve the western parts of the city into submission, the Berlin blockade was also a test of the emergent U.S. policy of containment. And that is the Berlin Airlift. Unwilling to abandon Berlin, the United States, Great Britain, and France began to deliver all needed supplies to West Berlin by air. The Marshall Plan, also known as the European Recovery Program, was a U.S. program providing aid to Western Europe following the devastation of World War II. And that's enacted in 1948 and provided more than $15 billion to help finance rebuilding efforts in the continent. Marshall, who was the U.S. Secretary of State, crafted a 4-year plan to reconstruct cities, industries, and infrastructure heavily damaged during the war and remove trade barriers between European neighbors, as well as foster commerce between those countries and the United States. Truman signed the Marshall Plan into law April 3rd, and aid was distributed to 16 nations, including Britain and France and Belgium and the Netherlands, West Germany and Norway. Out of this, in 1949, NATO would form. Well, the Berlin blockade would end on May 12th. A year and approximately 2 tons of supplies later, the Soviets admitted defeat and ended the blockade of Berlin. Oh, Nazis. That's me in what used to be East Germany. We don't want Nazis around. That's what it basically says. Nazis out. On May 23rd, the Federal Republic of Germany consisted of the unified Western zones and commonly referred to as West Germany was formed. The Soviets responded by creating the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, in early October. It's amazing how communist parties are always called Democrats, right? Democratic Republic. NATO is formed. There it is, the signing. It's April 4th. Secretary of State Dean Acheson and the foreign ministers of Canada and 10 Western European nations, Belgium, Denmark, France, Great Britain, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, and Portugal, gather in Washington, D.C. to sign the North Atlantic Treaty. NATO was set up in post-World War II atmosphere of anxiety, largely to block Soviet expansion into Europe. NATO is still around. The alliance created a military and political complement to the Marshall Plan for European economic recovery by establishing a mutual defense pact against possible aggression from the Soviet Union. Truman said of the treaty, it would create a shield against aggression and a fear of aggression, a bulwark, which will permit us to get on with the real business of achieving a fuller and happier life for all of our citizens. Well, that is Clement Attlee, that is Truman, that is Stalin. Of course, Attlee took over from Winston Churchill after he was booted out of office in 1945. Truman became president after Roosevelt died in April of 1945, and Stalin is still there. There would be a bad 33 days for Harry Truman, which still impacts us to this day. 2 incidents severely disrupted Americans' confidence in the ability of the United States to stop the spread of communism and limit Soviet power. August 29th, Soviet Union exploded its first atomic bomb. No longer did the United States have a monopoly on nuclear power. On October 1st, Chinese Communist Party leader Mao Zedong announced the triumph of the Chinese communists over the nationalist foes in a civil war that had been raging since 1927. The national forces, under the leader, Chiang Kai-shek, departed for Taiwan in December 1949. We're still talking about the possibility of China invading Taiwan in 2023. This has been festering for 74 years. Soviet atomic bomb changes everything. The effort to develop an atomic bomb had begun during World War II. Igor Kurchatov, a nuclear physicist, directed the research. The project benefited from work by captured German scientists as well as Soviet espionage efforts. Now let me ask you something. What happened to all the Nazis after 1945? And why were only about 2 dozen tried at Nuremberg? Where did the rest of them go? Well, a lot of them went to South America, particularly Argentina, but about 1,600 went to America, and that included Werner von Braun. They were scientists, and they were actually the people who put together the United States space missions, as well as bulked up the United States defense. A lot of them went to the Soviet Union as well. Stalin called for an all-out crash program to foster atomic energy research and development. August 1949, at a remote site in Kazakhstan, the Soviet Union detonates its first atomic bomb, codename First Lightning. In order to measure the effects of the blast of the bomb, the Soviet scientists constructed buildings, bridges, and other civilian structures in the vicinity of the bomb. They also placed animals in cages nearby so they could test the effects of nuclear radiation on human-like mammals. Well, things aren't good for Harry Truman. On September 3rd, a U.S. spy plane flying off the coast of Siberia picked up the first evidence of radioactivity from the explosion. On September 23rd, Truman announces to the American people, the Soviets have a bomb. The atomic explosion, the Soviet bomb, was about 20 kilotons, roughly equal to Trinity, the first U.S. atomic explosion, destroyed the structures, incinerated all the animals. And there's Mao Zedong. Bad 33 days. Soviets have a bomb. Well, Mao Zedong has a country now. In the 1920s, Mao Zedong lost faith in the leaders of the Chinese nationalist movement. He came to believe that only a revolutionary change of Chinese society could bring freedom from Western domination. In 1921, he became one of the founding members of the Communist Chinese Party. Mao was constantly in danger of arrest and execution by the nationalists. He split with his communist colleagues as they favored copying the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which brought communism to Russia in 1917. Mao instead said that the revolution in China would come from country peasants, not urban workers. And there is a young Mao Zedong. 1935 takes control of the party. Throughout the 1930s into World War II, Mao's forces continued their attacks on the Chinese government. They were victorious in 1949, and the Communist People's Republic of China was declared later that year. Here it is, October 1st, 1949, the world would change, and Americans would have no contact with the Chinese. The Communists gained control of mainland China, forced the leadership of the Republic of China to retreat to the island of Taiwan. There had been a political and military standoff with the ROC in Taiwan and the PRC in mainland China, both officially claiming to be the legitimate government of all of China. Well, the Americans backed Chiang Kai-shek and the Soong sisters and the others in Taiwan. There was Chiang Kai-shek and Mao in 1945. Chiang Kai-shek is in Taipei, in Taiwan. The fall of the mainland China to communists led the United States to suspend all diplomatic ties to the People's Republic of China. Geneva Convention, it's a busy year, 1949. All impacts us still today. Germany signed the convention, or signed the Convention of 1929. However, that did not prevent them from carrying off horrific acts on and off the battlefield and within military prison camps and civilian concentration camps during World War II. As a result, the 1949 Geneva Conventions were expanded to protect non-combatant civilians. Edward G. Robinson, Manuel Goldberg, Edward G. Robinson. The Blacklist, 1949. A lot of people in Hollywood lost their jobs, couldn't work anymore. And a lot of people were turning on one another because here the Soviets have the bomb. China is now a communist country, and there are all kinds of communists floating around the United States. January 8th, an FBI report stately flattered that many showbiz celebrities were communists. Frederick March, remember him? Two-time Oscar winner. Edward G. Robinson, Paul Robeson. The names were provided by unnamed sources. But 2 weeks later, Variety, the magazine, declared that this explosive news was backfiring. Hollywood and showbiz in general feels it has a noble victory in the past 10 days in its war against the red label, the blacklist. Variety said editorial writers, columnists, in interviews with man-on-the-street citizens agreed that the names of the FBI reports were used indiscriminately. What's more, Harry Truman holds a press conference saying that this list is just hysteria. But it's the beginning. It's the absolute beginning. The Red Scare actually starts in 1946 with this guy by the name of Billy Wilkerson. He owned the Hollywood Reporter. He also was the editor and a reporter for the Hollywood Trade magazine. He said he was going to name the alleged Reds in his Trade View column and expose the lurking menace. On July 29th, 1946, he published his Trade Views column, and the names included Dalton Trumbo and Howard Koch and Ring Lardner. I know Ring Lardner's two sons, Rex Lardner and Michael Lardner, and other Hollywood players that the editor branded as communist sympathizers. Wilkerson began the process of ruining lives. But it goes back even before that, 1941, Walt Disney. Walt Disney, who brings you such lovable characters as Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and Daisy Duck and Minnie Mouse and Goofy and Pluto and brought you movies like Dumbo and all that. Well, he's on the hunt looking for communists. Disney branded some of his former animators communists, said the Screen Actors Guild was a communist front, and labeled the 1941 strike that hit his studio a communist plot. He even contacted the FBI about alleged communist infiltration. Well, after the war, Ronald Reagan becomes the president of the Screen Actors Guild. On October 20th, 1947, members of the House on Un-American Activities Committee began an investigation into alleged communist influences in the film industry. And some of the biggest names going: Lauren Bacall, Humphrey Bogart, Gene Kelly, John Huston, signed a petition denouncing the committee as un-American itself for probing the politics of individual citizens. Reagan did testify that a small clique of communists have attempted to be a disruptive influence in the Screen Actors Guild. They become the Hollywood 10, as one would term. 10 screenwriters and directors refused to testify before the House on Un-American Activities, arguing that their First Amendment rights from the U.S. Constitution guaranteed the freedom to belong to any political organization they chose. November 1947. Congress didn't see it that way, and a month later the men were cited for contempt and ultimately sentenced to a year in prison. The 10 were Alvy Bessie, Herbert Bieberman, Lester Cole, Edward Dmytryk, Ring Lardner Jr., John Lawson, Albert Maltz, Samuel Ornitz, Adrian Scott, Dalton Trumbo. 1949, they're still hunting for Reds in Hollywood. Meanwhile, how many of you read the book 1984? Did you like the book? Did you like it? Did you like the book? Did you like it?
Sure.
Sure. It's still out there, right? 74 years later, it's still out there. 1984 was published in the United Kingdom on June 8th. The book focused on a futuristic totalitarian state that set out to control the thoughts of its citizens, rewrite history. It was an immediate success. The United Kingdom recognizes Ireland as an independent country. Since the Irish War of Independence against Britain in 1921, the island of Ireland has been divided between North and South. The partition of Ireland took place in 1921. The majority in Northern Ireland were British settlers who wished to remain a part of the UK. Well, okay, there's independence, but Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, and tensions between the Catholics of Northern Ireland and the Protestants grew as Northern Ireland remained under control of the British government. St. Anthony's, that is Newfoundland. And I spent a couple days in Newfoundland about 5 years ago. Newfoundland, if you ever listened in the 1940s to hockey games from Toronto, Foster Hewitt would be the announcer of Maple Leafs hockey, and he would say, and to all our friends across the, from coast to coast in Canada and the United States and Newfoundland, listening to this game, thank you for being here. Well, Newfoundland, prior to 1949, was not part of Canada in terms of being a province. On July 22nd, 1948, Newfoundlanders went to the polls to decide if they wanted to be a confederation or if they wanted to be part of a Dominion status. By a vote of 52-48, they decided to join the Confederation. Newfoundland joined Canada as a province on March 31st, 1949. Well, Jim Crow, it's after the war, lynchings all over the place, continuing. The Groveland Fort, in the summer, a 17-year-old lodged an accusation that would thrust the rural Florida community of Groveland into turmoil. The white teenager told police she and her husband were driving home from a dance when they were attacked by 4 young Negro men who abducted them and raped her at gunpoint. The claims made by Norma Paget set off a manhunt that spurred an onslaught of violence against black citizens of Groveland near Orlando, mobilizing the National Guard and prompting Thurgood Marshall, then the lead attorney for the NAACP, to take up the cause of the men. Ernest Thomas, Samuel Shepard, Charles Greenlee, Walter Irvin were accused of the crime, except there was no crime committed. It was made up. Thomas was killed by a posse that shot him more than 400 times. Civil rights, 1949. This is a civil rights map. And basically, if there are slashes through it, segregation of white and colored enforced by law. There are little dots, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, the Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada. Well, there's no legislation. The rest, the discrimination by numbers, travel, hotel, resorts, theaters, public schools, state colleges, private employment, public employment, civil rights, health welfare facilities, insurance, public and state-aided housing. Well, there were restrictions, 1949, right before my lifetime. States without stripes, polka dots on the West Coast or in the Midwest, Mid-Atlantic, or Southern New England have laws in place forbidding discrimination. Striped states in the South, Southwest enforce or permitted segregation. States in the Mountain West and Northern New England had no laws in place, and bare polka dots to signify the lack of laws. Meanwhile, in South Africa, Nelson Mandela is a young man at this point. On June 29th, the South African Citizens Act suspends the granting of citizenship to Commonwealth nations after 5 years of marriage and imposes a ban on mixed marriages. America had a ban on mixed marriages going back to the 19th century. Tokyo Rose. How many of you heard the name Tokyo Rose? Propagandist, right? That's what they said she was, propagandist. Iva Tagore Tequino, the American woman known as Tokyo Rose, was convicted of making propaganda radio broadcasts for the Japanese during World War II. She was tried because of the influential columnist, Walter Winchell. All my years in journalism, I never understood the appeal of Walter Winchell, Heather Hopper, these people on talk radio, all these people. I don't understand. These people basically know nothing. I know it. I've dealt with them. Anyway, Walter Winchell was a washed-up actor who turned washroom gossiper, according to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. He used his platform to pressure the government to take action. She became only the 7th U.S. citizen to be convicted of treason by an American jury. At her trial, she was convicted on one single count, that she did speak into a microphone concerning the loss of ships during wartime broadcasts out of Tokyo, designed to weaken the resolve of U.S. troops. She would serve 3 years in jail. And there is Tokyo Rose, 3 years in jail. Except Tokyo Rose didn't exist. It's a whole bunch of people. The nickname had been invented by U.S. troops to describe several women who made propaganda broadcasts under different aliases. So did she exist or didn't she exist? U.S. troops used to laugh at the Tokyo Rose stuff. TV in 1949. By the way, you probably can't see this well, but that is Betty White, 1949. KLAC TV in Los Angeles. 1949, according to a tally crafted by Radio and Television News Magazine, 1949, the total number of television sets sold in the United States in 1947, in 1948, 964,206. There are approximately 146 million people in America by that point. And you multiply that by, okay, say 3.5. That means about 3.5 million people out of 146 million people could watch TV. Betty White made her commercial TV debut, a show called Hollywood on TV. The Goldbergs debuted. How many of you remember Molly Goldberg? Did you watch or listen to it? You can still watch it on TV. It's out there. Faye Emerson, a woman, Faye Emerson, became the first late-night talk show host. It was a woman, not a man. Pauline Frederick, who was at ABC, who covered the 1948 political conventions, said that both men and women were welcomed in TV because neither one of them knew how TV worked. So what was the big deal? The Lone Ranger. How many of you watched The Lone Ranger? And Captain Video. You watch Captain Video. I've given a television, early days of TV talk, and one in Stanford, one in New Jersey. A woman in Stanford said, I used to have the helmet. I'd watch the Captain Video with the helmet on. My parents bought me the helmet. And this guy over in New Jersey said, I used to watch Captain Video with the helmet. I don't know who gave me the helmet, but I watched it with the helmet on. The helmet was probably worth more than the set. The set was literally made out of cheese board. First computer. Doesn't look like this thing, does it? The Manchester Mark I became operational in April. The Harvard Mark III, first of the Mark machines to use an internally stored program and indirect addressing, goes into operations under the direction of Howard Atkin. Around the world, Lucky Lady 2. People are still trying to go around the world with a plane. Captain James Gallagher and the U.S. Air Force crew make the first round-the-world non-stop flight from Fort Worth, Texas, and returning to the same point. 23,452 miles in 94 hours and a minute, and they did that between February 27th and March 2nd. I don't think any of you saw Joe Louis fight. You probably have heard of Joe Louis, but I don't think any of you, because his last fight was in 1951. The Brown Bomber is the world heavyweight champion from 1937 to 1949. He retires from boxing for the first time in 1949. He has 68 wins, 1 loss. He's regarded as one of the greatest boxers of all time, a breaker of racial barriers, and because of his service in World War II, a national hero. As Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini seized power in Europe, Louis defeated the Italian champion, Primo Carnera, but suffered his first professional loss to the German Superman Max Schmeling, 1936. Following year, Louis beat Jim Braddock to win the World Heavyweight Championship. And then there's the rematch with Schmeling. And it's kind of the Americans against the Germans preview of World War II. The Americans knew what was going on in Germany in 1938. In the 1938 rematch between Louis and Schmeling, Louis knocks out Schmeling in just 2 minutes and 4 seconds. Americans looked up to Louis, even though he was a Negro, as a hero, simultaneously crushing the Nazi master race notions. It took 2 Negroes to do that. Jesse Owens, 1936 Olympics, and Joe Louis in 1938 in the boxing ring. The end of a rival. I don't know how many of you are going to watch the Super Bowl. Anybody plan to watch the Super Bowl this year? Nobody's going to watch the Super Bowl. Super Bowl is America's biggest party day of the year. The Beer Institute gave me all kind of facts about what Americans do. And the only days that Americans might drink more beer than Super Bowl Sunday, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and the 4th of July. Depends on the year. Football wasn't a big deal in 1949. Wasn't a big deal at all. The All-American Football Conference was organized by the Chicago Tribune sports editor Arch Ward. Teams in New York, Buffalo, Miami, Cleveland, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles. They were going to start playing in 1946. But by 1949, they were losing money. Chicago couldn't support a third team after the NFL's Bears and Cardinals. The Los Angeles Dons, among their owners was Don Amici and Bob Hope, among others. They're tapped out. The Brooklyn Dodgers merged with the New York Yankees. The league, the AAFC, was on the ropes. Both leagues were little more than semi-pro operations. They weren't legitimate operations. Well, the 4-year pro-grid war ends. AFL, AAFC merge on December 9th. 3 teams are admitted to the NFL: the Cleveland Browns, the San Francisco 49ers, and Baltimore Colts. The Los Angeles Dons merge operations with the Los Angeles Rams, while Buffalo, Chicago, and New York folded. That is Art Rooney and Stan Rooney. Dan Rooney led the Pittsburgh Steelers to Super Bowls in the 1970s, and I got to talk to him about this merger, and he said they were going out of business, and we just felt getting a West Coast team, San Francisco, was important, and getting Cleveland was important. We brought in Baltimore, but they didn't make it at that particular time. But the 49ers and Cleveland Browns were very important, particularly to get to a national scope. That was a good move. There was another merger of sorts too. Basketball Association of America and the National Basketball League. Any basketball fans here today? People watch basketball? Well, NBA, majority of players in NBA are African American. Basketball Association of America and the first year of the National Basketball Association, 1949-50, 0 African Americans in the league. There was a color barrier that was put up. The Basketball Association of America was conceived by Northeast United States arena owners looking to fill dates at their arenas in 1946. National Basketball League was created in 1937. It was a moderately successful basketball organization, the first. They had this guy, George Mikan. George Mikan was Superman. He was the greatest player of his time. They changed rules to stop him. Whether he could play today the way he was, with the glasses and all, that's another question. But during his time era, he was the best. The BAA was in the big cities. The NBL was in the much smaller cities. But the NBL had the more talented players, and the BAA wanted those players. Players like Mikan, who joined the NBA in 1948. In Rochester, they joined the league also in 1948. They have top-notch players. NBL is about ready to go out of business. On August 3rd, the NBL and the BAA became one. Syracuse, Denver, Anderson, Tri-Cities in Wisconsin, Sheboygan in Wisconsin, Waterloo, Iowa were added to the league. They didn't stay very long. The NBL employed Negro players in the early 1940s. The BAA had a color barrier. The new entity blocked Negroes from playing in the league. Negro basketball teams such as the Harlem Globetrotters and the New York Reds were viewed as legitimately great teams. So there was no reason to keep the players out, except the owners decided to keep the players out. Meanwhile, the NBA saw firsthand just how good black players were. The Globetrotters, heard of the Harlem Globetrotters, right? Harlem Globetrotters. They played Minneapolis a couple times. February 28th, the BAA's Minneapolis Lakers took on the Harlem Globetrotters in a rematch of an exhibition game in 1948 that was held in Chicago. The 1948 Lakers, led by George Mikan, they were in the other league, the NBL. The BAA, you know, this thing about having no Negroes around, you're telling us there's money available? Oh, okay, let's take the money. Let's forget about our color barrier. 20,046 people watched the rematch when the Lakers lost to the Globetrotters in Chicago. Oh, by the way, the NBA made a ton of money. NASCAR started. I don't know how many of you watch NASCAR, but they're just beating up old cars, running around in circles. The first strictly stock race NASCAR holds is on June 19th, Charlotte, North Carolina. 13,000 fans watched Jim Roper win the race, and Sarah Christian finishes 14th, a woman driving a car in a major race. She's the first woman to ever compete in a car race, NASCAR. In the early years, NASCAR competitors drove the same type of cars that you would drive. Buick, Cadillacs, Oldsmobiles, and they modified it. There was something called a ball of goo that you played with as a kid. This ball of glue ended up becoming rubber. Okay, so that's James Wright. And he is going to invent something. During World War II, rubber shortages threatened war production. The government asked U.S. companies to invent a synthetic rubber with similar properties that could be made with non-restricted rationed ingredients. 1943, an engineer by the name of James Wright was attempting to discover synthetic rubber while working at the General Electric Laboratory in New Haven, Connecticut. He found something unusual. In a test tube, he combined boric acid and silicon oil, producing an interesting gob of glue. Well, he conducted some more tests and discovered when dropped or stretched farther than rubber, it didn't collect mold, had a very high melting temperature, but it couldn't replace rubber. That's rubber. 1949, the New Haven toy store owner, Ruth Fallgater, attended a GE party and decided to include that tub of glue in her holiday catalog. She encased the globs of the gloop, that's what it was called, globs of gloop, in clear plastic cases. Sold them at $2 each. The putty outsold everything else in the catalog. But Fallgater's interest soon waned and she discontinued the quirky product. That quirky product you know as silly putty. How many of you play with silly putty? They were looking for something else during the war and you ended up with silly putty. Peter C. Hodgson, marketer of silly putty, dies at the age of 64. Hodgson was a toy store marketer, and he looks for 1949, says, why don't we try this? Let's call it silly putty. Well, the rest is history. Oh, how many of you had 45s growing up? Rock around the clock? Sure, you had your little hi-fi, and you had that thing that you had to put in the middle, right? Because to keep the record from spinning out. Well, this is 1949, and the 45 record is out there. The 7-inch 45 RPM record was released March 15th by RCA Victor as a smaller, more durable, and higher fidelity replacement for the 78 RPM shellac disc. The first 45 recordings were monaural with recordings on both sides of the disc. The initial 7 RCA releases included a song called That's All Right, which would become a major hit for somebody else about 5 years later. It was done by Arthur Big Boy Crudup, and the Yiddish song, A Kleine Medela, The Little Teacher. That's what you could get. Pyramid clubs. Ever hear about pyramid clubs? Yeah, you can lose a lot of money in a pyramid club. Pyramid clubs, in which each investor recruits 2 more than passes the money up the line, were springing up around North America. Investors in the pyramid clubs were invited to parties held for the express purpose of gathering their $1 membership fees in the club. They were then obliged to hold their own parties to collect money to send up the steps of a pyramid. The pyramid worked like this. At his or her first party, a new member hands over $2, becomes one of many number 125 at the base of the pyramid. The next night, she may, or he, may become number 11. Must bring in 2 new members, each with $2 to keep the organization intact. On each subsequent night, new members multiply and form pyramids behind them. He or she is pushed to the peak of the pyramid until the 12th night becomes number 1 and theoretically gets $4,096. Pyramid schemes were illegal, and the odds of winning were incredibly small. Here's a guy who probably won. The Bureau of Internal Revenue announced that it would check the income tax returns of those who were successful in pyramid schemes, and that would prosecute those who did not list such incomes. Arrests were made, the fad faded out. Panty raids. You ever hear of panty raids? Nobody's ever heard of a panty raid? College campuses. Augusta College Panty Raid, 1949. Panty raid was an American college prank in which large groups of male students attempted to invade the living quarters of female students and steal their panties as trophies of their success. On February 25th at Augustana College, Rock Island, Illinois, about 125 men entered the women's building. First party entered through heating tunnels beneath the buildings. Once inside, they unlocked the door for the remaining raiders to enter, locked the house mother in her apartment, cut the lights and phone. Although a few women reported missing undergarments, the goal was to cause commotion. The police arrived, and although no pranksters were charged, news traveled, making headlines in the Chicago Tribune, Stars and Stripes, Time Magazine, and the New York Times. The Volkswagen, that Nazi car, ends up in America. On January 17th, the first VW Type 1 to arrive in the United States, 1948 model, is brought to New York by a Dutch businessman, Ben Pond. Unable to interest dealers or importers in the Volkswagen, Pond sells the car to pay his travel expenses. Only 2 1946 models were sold in America that year, convincing the Volkswagen chairman, Heinrich Nordhoff, the car had no future in America. How many of you remember the Volkswagen? No future in America. How many of you saw South Pacific? You saw it? Did you like it? Yeah. Hammerstein and Rogers and Hammerstein. It ran for 1,925 performances, songs that were included in the play Some Enchanted Evening, Younger Than Springtime. And oh, I love Warner Brothers cartoons. I grew up on Warner Brothers cartoons. Most of the things I know in life are because of Warner Brothers cartoons. And these guys, I think of them as human. I just think of them as actors. And yeah, they were put together by humans. But these 2 cartoon characters, along with Acme, the company that supplied Wile E. Coyote with his equipment, make their debut. Fast and Furious, Warner Brothers Looney Tunes cartoon, directed by Chuck Jones, written by Michael Mortiz, was released on September 17, 1949. The stars, Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner. This was the first pairing of the Coyote and Roadrunner. So the 1949 legacy, and we are living with a lot of it, the Soviet Union's development of an atomic bomb led to a new phase in the Cold War, with annihilation as a possibility. How many of you did this back in the day? How many of you did that? How many of you ducked and covered? Never did? I did. That came to the head with the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1942. Through ping-pong diplomacy, the United States and the People's Republic of China resumed diplomatic relations starting in 1971. The U.S. and China, U.S.-Russia have uneasy relationships. That's St. Petersburg, about 11 years ago when I was in Russia. Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. On October 3rd, 1990, East Germany and West Germany reunited after the end of World War II, 45 years later. In Ireland, the Troubles, which pitted Northern Ireland against England, came to an end after a peace process chaired by U.S. Senator George Mitchell, former U.S. Senator, led to the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. There's been relative peace in the region since then. In 2017, the Florida legislature formally apologized to the Groveland 4 families. In 2018, the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, directed the State Department of Law Enforcement to review the case. In 2019, Governor Ron DeSantis and the state's 3-member cabinet granted pardons for the 4. In 2021, the case was dismissed and the 4 were exonerated. Joe Louis came out of retirement in 1950. He had earned $5 million as a fighter, but he spent or gave everything away. He owed the IRS $1 million in back taxes. He returned to the ring to pay off his debts. By the 1970s, panty raids faded because of mixed dorms and less inhibited attitudes to sexual intercourse on college campuses. There is Joe Louis. Louis fought Ezra Charles for the championship September 27, 1950, lost a 15-round decision, fought again in 51, became a wrestler and a Las Vegas greeter, casino greeter because of money problems. After his death in 1981, he was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. One of the pallbearers was Schmeling. Apartheid ended in South Africa in 1994. The 45s became a major component of the rock and roll era. Eventually, new technology would replace the 45s, including the CD. Pyramid clubs never returned. Silly putty remains a popular children's toy. The Volkswagen sold well in America until 1979. 1984 is regarded as a classic book, read in schools, most schools, hasn't been banned yet. Terms from the book such as Big Brother and Thought Police still used today. National Football League is America's most successful sports group, taking in billions of dollars in annual revenue. National Basketball Association is a global entity, taking in billions of dollars in annual revenue. NASCAR is big business. Her TV career started in 1949. Betty White. She had a career spanning 7 decades. The blacklist would eventually fade by the 1960s. Computers became smaller and smaller and smaller and are engaged in everyday life. The Fair Deal raised the minimum wage, promoted slum clearance, extended old age benefits to an additional 10 million people. On January 19, 1977, one of his last acts in office, President Gerald Ford pardoned Tokyo Rose. Iva Tagore was then 60 years old and was exonerated of treason and restored her American citizenship. That's all, folks. Any questions? Any comments? Time for you to speak.